So those of you that know me know that I have this fascination with what was happening in Germany immediately prior to the start of World War II, and particularly the rise of the Nazi Party, and what was happening, frankly, throughout Europe, in Italy as well, with the rise of fascism. And as I think about what's happening in this country today, I see a lot of parallels between pre-Nazi Germany and the fascism that was making its way across particularly Italy prior to World War II. Now, I want to think about some of the key elements of fascism and encourage all of you to study a little bit about the fascism doctrine and what was occurring, particularly there in Italy. But understand the differences between the form of socialism that was being espoused by the Nazi Party and the violent actions of the Nazi Party, the fascism. But let's talk about fascism, because I think that has a direct application to what's happening here in America today. You know, one of the key elements of fascism is the corporate state, or the connection between corporatism, or the means of production, and the government and institutions. And you know, as I go into courtrooms every single day, one of the things that disturbs me is that when you have judges who are making a connection between what's happening in their courtrooms and the larger economic picture, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I want judges to be thinking about the larger picture, about the fact that what happens in their courtroom has a dramatic impact on communities at large and on our economy at large. But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, because, you know, we all understand now that the banks and institutions that are foreclosing upon this country are directly supported by the American taxpayer. And so there is indeed a direct connection between what happens to the banks and institutions and the American taxpayers. And you hear this again and again, even in very thoughtful judges, these judges who unfortunately are taking the role of a second prosecutor. We hear this phrase now, we're starting to develop this, that, you know, some judges are taking the role on as being a second prosecutor of the cases. They're looking at these cases on their docket, foreclosure cases, and they're looking at the rules of judicial administration, which suggests that they have an obligation to move cases along. And these judges are taking it upon themselves to move foreclosure cases along and set them for trial. Some expressing that, you know, they want to move their docket along, and they feel that that's part of the judicial responsibility. But others expressing concern over the fact that they don't want borrowers living there, quote unquote, for free. So, would this be an element if the corporations were completely independent, private corporations that didn't have a direct connection with you and I as taxpayers, and frankly with the judges and with our government in general? And I submit to you that the answer to that question is no. If the corporations that were in these courtrooms were in fact completely private, independent entities, if, as you say, the government and you and I as taxpayers didn't have a dog in the fight, as it were, with regard to what happens with these corporations, these good judges and judges wouldn't have as much concern about setting these things for trial, or much concern of the homeowner, quote-unquote, living there for free. So, again, focus on these elements of fascism and the connection between corporatism and fascism, and understanding that one of the key problems that exists now is the close unity between these corporations, particularly the banks and institutions we know of them now as the too-big-to-fail institutions, and our government. We see expression of this in the 49-state Attorney General settlement, and there was a very interesting quote with Sean Donovan, the HUD secretary, who was pushing through this settlement. In an interview he gave, he referred to the servicers as, quote-unquote, our servicers. And in fact, that's a true statement. These servicers, these private banks that are operating on behalf of the federal government through their principals, Fannie and Freddie, there is such a connection between the government, taxpayers, taxpayer dollars, investment dollars, that it's not private corporations or private money at stake in these loans or in these disputes anymore. The connection between the corporations and Fannie and Freddie, who the taxpayers are all backstopping, provides some real problems in terms of resolving cases or deciding cases on their own merits. So, again, we need to first understand the fact that this connection between the private corporations, the banks and institutions that are servicing loans, and the banks and institutions maybe that made these loans, but particularly the banks and institutions that are servicing loans on behalf of Fannie and Freddie, who are effectively adjuncts of the federal government, and the connection between what's happening in those loans to the servicers and what's happening in our courtrooms. Judges in courtrooms should not be acting as adjuncts or apologist for the corporations, even when these quote-unquote private corporations are servicing and taking action on behalf of the federal government, federal agencies. You and I are now taxpayer dollars. So, these truly are disturbing times, very dangerous times. And we see it over and over again, this connection between our government and the corporations who have done so much damage. Our nation was founded on basic principles of separation in church and state. Well, we were also founded on principles of private organizations, private companies running things and entrepreneurship. But that's all been diminished dramatically, especially over the last couple of years, where we have this deep connection between the federal government and these private corporations, especially with the direct endorsement lenders, which go out and make loans with explicitly the full faith and credit of the United States government. This corporatism, economic corporatism, and the connection between the corporations and our government is one of the truly disturbing things, and one of the black forces that operate within this current crisis environment, where our judges feel compelled to take action on behalf of corporations because of this connection. Please continue to watch this and study what was happening in Germany prior to the rise of the Nazi Party, and what was happening in Italy as the fascism took hold throughout the country. And understand that this is happening today in this country. The very same elements that exist, the economic elements, the social elements, the political elements, the legal elements, existed. And understand, too, that another key element of this rising fascism has to do with silencing dissent, has to do with squelching protest, has to do with limiting the free expression of ideas and communication of exactly what I'm doing. So, it's not at all hard to picture that there are people out there, the corporations and in the government, who don't want conversations like I'm having right now being had, and what might they do in order to try and silence this. Certainly I've been attacked, and certainly there have been persecutions of me personally, as there have been for every single person who's dared to stand up to these corporations and our judges and the court system that are conspiring together against the American people. But for you that are watching this and asking, what's the impact on my life? The impact is, if you don't get out there and start talking about these things, if you don't get your neighbors involved, if you don't get you involved, then you can't stand aside and complain when things get much, much worse, when the boot comes at your door to kick down and take you out. So keep that in mind and keep studying.